Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. Today's video is about the transition of power from one president to another and what effect that can have on the workings of the national government. Over the course of this video, we'll be talking about the situations under which a president could lose office or lose his authority, and some examples of this occurring over the course of American history. And we'll also be describing the effects of having a new president or an outgoing president on policy and the relationship between the president and the rest of the government, most notably Congress. So with that, let's get started. There are some exceptions to the rule that we'll talk about on the next slide, but usually the president just leaves office because there's going to be a new president. The president leaves office either because he's being forced out by term limits, that could be formal or informal. Remember, before the 22nd Amendment was passed in the 1950s, a president could technically serve as many terms as he wanted, although following George Washington's example, every president up until Franklin Roosevelt had stopped at 2 terms. But the 22nd Amendment ensured that no president would be elected 4 times. Again, as Franklin Roosevelt had been in 32, 36, 40, and 44. A president could also be defeated in his bid for re-election. This was more common before 1900, but since 1900 it's only happened 4 times. Taft, Hoover, Carter, and most recently in 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush was easily defeated by Bill Clinton. 9 presidents, however, have left office before the end of the term they were currently serving. 1 in a helicopter and 8 in a box. 4 presidents have died of natural causes. 4 have been assassinated, most recently Kennedy in 1963. And 1 president resigned the office. That is, of course, Richard Nixon, resigning when impeachment seemed imminent over his role in the Watergate break-in and subsequent cover-up. In all of these cases, the deceased president was succeeded by their vice president, and luckily, in all cases prior to the 25th Amendment, there was a vice president in office. Had there been a vacancy in the office of the vice presidency, someone else would have succeeded to the office depending on the time period we're talking about. At various times in American history, the next in line after the vice president has been the president pro tem of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, or even the Secretary of State. But the 25th Amendment codified that and ensured a smooth and clear transition of power should the president and vice president both become unable to serve, or should the offices become vacant. Following the assassination of John F. Kennedy and fueled by Cold War fears of what could happen if a nuclear strike or some other attack, killed multiple high-ranking government officials, the Congress passed and the states ratified the 25th Amendment to the Constitution in 1967, which clearly laid out what should occur if the president dies or otherwise becomes unable to discharge the duties of his office. Under the 25th Amendment, the president is succeeded by the vice president. Then, if both of those are unable to serve, the Speaker of the House, then the president pro tempore of the Senate, and then the cabinet officers in the order of the date that cabinet department was established. So it starts with Secretary of State, then goes to Treasury, then Defense, and on, all the way down to the Secretary of Homeland Security. The big change the 25th Amendment effected was that vice presidents could now be appointed if the vice presidency became vacant because of the ascension of the vice president to the office of president. Before the 25th Amendment, if the vice president became president, the vice presidency remained vacant until the next presidential election. In the case of when Harry Truman became president after the death of FDR in 1945, the vice presidency remained vacant until January of 1949, so nearly a full 4 years. But now, under the 25th Amendment, the president can appoint a new vice president, and that vice president, once he's confirmed by a majority vote in the House and in the Senate, takes the office. The only time the 25th Amendment has ever been used to appoint a new vice president was in the 1970s. First, with Gerald Ford being appointed vice president in 1973 to succeed Spiro Agnew, who had to resign after a criminal investigation. And then, when Ford became president upon Nixon's resignation a year later, he appointed former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, known affectionately in his state as Rocky, to the vice presidency, and the two of them served together until 1977. The president can also be deemed unable to discharge his office by a vote by the cabinet and the vice president. That has never actually been done. There are some instances in American history where that might have occurred had the 25th Amendment been in existence. Most notably in 1919, Woodrow Wilson had a very, very severe stroke, which left him essentially an invalid and a recluse for the last 2 years of his presidency. And had the 25th Amendment existed, it's thought that his cabinet probably would have relieved him of his powers as president, but of course that wasn't in place at the time. There are two other notable ways a president could be removed from office that have never actually occurred. A president could be impeached and removed from office in theory. Two presidents have been impeached, Andrew Johnson in 1868 and Bill Clinton in 1998. Both were acquitted in the Senate, although Andrew Johnson was only acquitted by one vote. Oddly enough, going back to what we just discussed about vacancies in the vice presidency, Andrew Johnson became president upon the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and there was no vice president. So had Andrew Johnson been convicted and removed from office, at that time the president pro tem was next in line, so you would have heard at some point about a President Benjamin Wade, but that did not come to pass. The president can also be ruled incapacitated by the 25th Amendment, as we've already mentioned here. This has not happened for any kind of long term where the cabinet and vice president decide that the president can't do his job because of illness or dementia or something like that. It has been invoked in rare cases because of health reasons. Ronald Reagan, one time in 1985, and George W. Bush on two occasions in 2002 and 2007 invoked the 25th Amendment and transferred the powers of the presidency to their vice presidents. That's George H.W. Bush and Dick Cheney, respectively. So those two men did, for a period of several hours on three occasions, serve as acting president of the United States. Oddly enough, when Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981 and had to go into emergency surgery, the 25th Amendment was not invoked because George H.W. Bush was on a plane on the way back to Washington, D.C. and was unable to assume the duties of the office of president. And by the time he got back to Washington, D.C., President Reagan was out of surgery. So, again, on a few occasions, president's power has been transferred, but just for very short bursts of time. Now that we've gone over all the nuts and bolts of how presidents can leave office and come into office and all of that, we can talk about how the presidency is sort of affected and how the president's relationship with the rest of the government, namely Congress, can be affected. When a new president first comes into office, they tend to have a measure of goodwill from the public. They haven't done anything to become remarkably unpopular yet, for example. So they have some level of trust and, as I said, goodwill from both elected members of Congress and from the people nationwide. And so that's called a honeymoon period. During that time, the president can usually get at least some of what he wants to get done before he does something that, begins to cause his approval ratings to dip and create, a bad relationship with Congress. maybe the quickest honeymoon period ever was Gerald Ford's, which lasted only 1 month in 1974 before he pardoned Richard Nixon, which was a grossly unpopular move, and immediately Ford came under fire for having done that, despite coming into office as, not Richard Nixon, which made him popular with a lot of people just sort of by default. Now, when a president leaves office or is about to leave office, the president undergoes what's called a lame duck period. And this really applies to congressmen who've been defeated as well. But lame duck is a slang term for someone who doesn't have much time left in office and therefore no longer has a lot of clout or authority in doing their job. Usually, lame duck presidents have very little influence, especially if they were defeated for re-election. They're not popular at all, and they're going to be leaving office in 2 months. So it's pretty hard for a lame duck president to really get anything done. Most people, especially if the president is unpopular, would prefer to wait until the new president is sworn in and work with that person, because they're going to be around considerably longer, and it's easier to, especially undertake long-term projects if you've got someone who's going to be in office for a longer period of time. That will do it for today. As always, make sure you're keeping up with all of your readings and watching the videos if you're in my class, and feel free to ask if you have any questions. Cheers.